Hey, my name is James Britt. I'm going to talk a bit about what I call black boxing with Ruby. A little bit of background about myself. I run some Ruby sites. Probably most notably, I run ruby-doc.org, and I've been writing Ruby code since about 2000, 2001, and I've written a number of Ruby articles and parts of books and so on like that. Basic idea of what I want to talk about, it's sort of an overview, recounting some experiences I've had in trying to work with applications, primarily web applications, that aren't written in Ruby, don't necessarily expose the kind of API or interface that I want, and yet I want for my client code, say command line tools or some other application, I want a decent kind of Ruby API. So the definition here of black boxing is just interacting with some other app that doesn't have my particular interests in mind. Black box, again, for my purposes, is just some unknown entity that you may only know how it works from its outside behavior. You may not have any access to its internals and to all its guts or any opportunity to really hook into it. So I'll accept that this is, for our purposes, a good enough definition. So the story behind this is James needed some sort of project tracking tool. In another case, James wanted some kind of commenting system for a particular application, and in general, James liked a whole bunch of stuff that just wasn't written in Ruby. There's a lot of nice stuff that's out there. There's Track for project tracking that some people have mentioned. I know a lot of people use. There's WordPress for various things, which if you're doing blogging or certain kinds of presentation work and so on, is actually quite good. I like Amazon's EC2, Elastic Compute Cloud for various things. There are some Ruby things for it, but they're not quite as complete as I'd like. There's Cafe Press Shops. One of the sites I run is rubystuff.com, which is sort of a portal aggregator for a bunch of Cafe Press Shops. And all these cases are things I want to work with tools that were written from Ruby my end to things that weren't necessarily Ruby friendly on the other end. So one question that I think you might want to comes up when you talk to people about this is why not just build everything myself? Right? If I can't find a project tracking tool that has just the right API I want, I just build it. And the reason is because that's just insane. I know that many people, when they work on projects, half the fun is building the tools to help you build your main project, but it's a mouse hole. You can just chase that forever and spend more time building tools than building your actual project. And I've been there and done that, so I don't really want to keep after that all the time. Why not use a Ruby app? Well, truth is, there's not always a good selection available, right? I mean, people do talk about writing a Ruby substitute for Track. There are Ruby options, I think, that aspire perhaps to what WordPress offers, but I don't know if they're quite there. Even if they are, there's another aspect to this, which is just plain mind share. Even if you find an application written in the language of your choice, it's a question of when a bug is found, when there's a security problem, when there's a feature request, how many people are going to be out there to fix it, to patch it, to pitch in. So I'm pretty confident that if I'm using Track and there's a problem, they're just all these developers are going to jump on it and they're going to solve it. And the best part is I'm not going to be one of those developers having to jump on it and solve it. And that just leaves me free to focus on the things that I want to do. So what it really comes down to is when you need a particular tool, it's secondary to what you're mainly trying to accomplish or just has some particularly useful feature. Yes, it's nice when you can do everything in pure Ruby. The reality is that isn't always what's going to work best for you, and you needn't get blinded by this kind of language fundamentalism. Okay, because basically the P languages are not the work of Satan, right? But don't let that out of this room, okay? I'll deny it if you ever pass it around that I said that. All right? Another thing behind all this, big motivation just for me personally, is there's a lot of me when I go off to do something, it's hey, I wonder if, you could take this and hook it up with that and spin it around that way and so on. I mean, anybody who had a chemistry kit growing up, I think, knows, like, what happens when you mix the blue stuff with the red stuff and put it over a fire. There's a lot of that thinking that goes on. Same thing with mechanical devices. Oddly enough, when I grew up, I was known as the one who always broke stuff, even though I was also the one who always fixed stuff. But, I view a lot of what I've been doing when I have a chance just experimenting with certain ideas. What I found when you do things like that, you end up in odd development territory and wind up learning or doing things that you would not have considered doing were you to take perhaps, well, the right path, perhaps, or the obvious path. Okay? So keep that in mind when you go through this, all right? So I think for most speakers, when they give a presentation, this is what they want from the audience, right? This is what it may be, all right? That's fine. This, however, is the path to enlightenment, so I'm good with that. So, start off with Track. Track is an excellent project tracking tool. You can argue with me afterwards. I'm sure there are alternatives. I'm quite happy with it. It does basically what I want. It gets out of the way, has nice features. It lets me look at my SVN repo, has a wiki, I can set permissions. It works. It does what I want, okay? But there's way too much mousing for many things. If you've ever tried to add a ticket or so on to Track, you have to open up a browser and click on stuff and go through. And it's fine for the one-off things. It's particularly useful if you open up your Track repo, your Track site to clients and give them an opportunity to put things in. But it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And just in general, web pages are poor data entry tools. So I asked myself, hey, I wonder if I could use Track from the command line. And the situation really was this. I find myself working on projects, and I'm coding away, and I come into something that I see as a problem. I don't want to fix it right away, because it's not really the problem that I'm facing right now. Perhaps I noticed that the CSS alignment on a certain page is just wrong. I got to make a note of it. I don't want to do it in, say, some temporary notes file, and then later on have to remember to go put it up on Track. What I wanted, while I'm at the command line, was just type it out, and boom, have it magically appear at Track. So that was real scratch the itch practical thing. I needed to be able to do something so I wouldn't break the flow of my work. And, the answer now is yes, you can use Trackula. This is an application library I've written to interact with Track primarily from the command line, primarily through rake tasks. And let me see if I actually get this working. I did try to do some screen capturing stuff because I don't like live demos. Me and live demos have a really bad history. So I'll see if I can get this to perform well to kind of give you what it's like. You can make that out. Basically, you just type as a rake task, Track:tickets. It goes up to the server, and it pulls back a list of all the open tickets. That was something I just wanted. At any given time when I was working on something, I wanted to be able to go and see what was open and what was going on. Oops. If I find the desktop now. Likewise, I want to be able to add tickets from the command line through a series of prompts. Here's another high-tech audio-visual presentation. Similar thing, as a rake task, you can type Track:ticket, and how fast this goes. It prompts you for a bunch of information. There's some reasonable defaults I put in there. This is practically unreadable. You'll have to take my word for it that that's actually what's going on. Imagine, if you will, that this thing is graciously asking you what milestone does it belong to, what's the component type, is it a task, is it a defect, and you'll just post it back up there. Because that's, in fact, exactly what it does. Yeah, okay. So personally, I found that much, much nicer than just having to open up a web browser every time I had a ticket. Even if you leave the browser open, it just wasn't what I wanted to do. So some of the things, basically, here's how it works. It's not deep rocket science. It's HPCOT mechanized going up there and pretending to be a web browser. And it goes up there and just simulates it. There's a config file that just loads username and password and the URL for the Track repo. There's a couple of other things in there just to make it easy and nice, and it works out behind the scene. So I'm quite happy because I've gotten to interact with ostensibly a foreign application written in Python. I did not, well, I was lying if I said I didn't have to actually go look at the Python. I did. So there's the URL if you want to go poke around. I realize that actually that URL is not going to tell you how you can get the code or the gem, but I'll have to update that. And it's kind of raw and beta, alpha, gamma-ish. So, but you can let me know if and when you find problems with the code. So this is great, and it solved my problem, but there were some glitches with it. Okay, for one thing, the Python guys, every time they had a new version of track, it was different, right? It was like it was new or something. And it was new enough in different ways that it would break stuff. So when I first started doing this for the form field where you would submit a ticket, it was pretty straightforward. And I changed servers, and I had to reinstall track. And when I went back to use it, it was just falling on the floor. It just wasn't working. It turns out there's now a hidden form field that does verification against a cookie that has sort of a GUID for your particular process. Fixing that was not phenomenally difficult, but it was just an annoyance. Okay? The other thing is, as I spent more time with track, I became more aware of plugins. I figured out the Python egg thing and how to install it and get things done right, and there's quite a lot of nice stuff. So, for example, most of my track sites are off on some whatever URL with HT basic authentication, HT access files and stuff to restrict access. But for the Tracula site, I wanted just a general open page, and I wanted a nicer login. Track has a plugin that handles that, but again, the irony is Tracula doesn't actually work against the Tracula track site precisely because there's a different means of authentication. So there's a certain amount of brittleness that gets introduced when you're trying to do this sort of thing. When you go against any kind of web page, you put yourself at a certain risk because guaranteed the people maintaining the page are not thinking of what they're presenting as an API or an interface. To them, it's just whatever it is that people click on. So here are some lessons learned. One, HBCOT and Mechanize truly kick ass. If you've not spent any time with it, you really should. If you're manipulating HTML that comes down from pages, they do a very good job of taking almost randomly sloppy HTML and fixing it up such that you can reach in there and grab images and forms and tables, whatever information you need. Second thing is, if it's on the web, it has an API. Granted, yes, it's fragile, but at least you should consider that as you look at things, anything that's out there, if you can get to it through a browser, particularly with tools like HBCOT and Mechanize, you should start thinking of how can I automate the interaction with this website. Because it's just text. When you fetch a page, you're just getting text back. It's text that follows some pretty well understood rules. You can go up there, you can grab it, you can manipulate it and post it back. And the tools now to do this in Ruby have gotten really, really good. But yes, it's fragile because someone decides they're going to shift around where the tables are or what a form field is called and so on, and everything kind of falls on the floor. But the upside is very easy to get started. It didn't take me that long to get a basic version of Tracula up and running to the point where I could use it. And most of what I ended up doing after was just trying to clean it up to the point where I could open it up and get other people to use it. And to speak to what Gregory was talking about earlier, there's a real motivation in doing that because while I wrote this for myself, I would like to see it do more. But I don't necessarily want to be the only person doing it. I think arguably it's useful to other people. So to the extent that I can make an effort to get other people interested and give back, that comes back and becomes more valuable to me. So those people who are working on projects, even when you start out to build something just to scratch your own itch, even out of self-interest, there's a way to look at this to make it worth your while to get some docs up there, get a nice page, make it easy for people to get started and so on. So yeah, there's still some features missing. That's okay. I'll add them when I need them. Basically what it does for me now is I can get a list of tickets. I can post a single ticket back up from the command line. And another very useful thing is I can create a YAML file that describes a whole slew of tickets and post them up en masse. And the reason this was valuable, there is a plugin for Track. I'm not sure how easy it is to install now. I had to apply a patch at the time that I did it that lets you attach time estimates and figure out velocity for your projects. And I found it very useful when going through a spec. If I had a contract, to just run down the list of requirements and start putting times against them and so on. And then I would just put the whole thing up into Track, and let it kind of figure out my estimates, and then I can work off of that. And it seemed like a reasonable way to store this information without having to type it over and over in multiple cases. But the idea of having to hand type all these tickets was just too much work for a lazy person like me. I'd rather invest that time and energy into writing code. So now, yes, I could sit down, for example, and just make a big bug list of what's wrong with my project, type it all up in a simply structured YAML file, and have that whole thing slurped in. And basically what Tractlet does is it loops over it and does a series of single postings, but I don't really have to worry about that. Another problem here is that there's a bunch of missing behavior. I haven't found a nice way to ask Track for a list of current milestones. So I cheat. I go up to the web page and I hand copy it and I post it into the config file so that now when Track runs, it knows what to display. And what's handy about that is I find that the automatic post would fail if I did not provide a proper milestone for any ticket that I was submitting. So the code now just ensures that I provide one that makes sense, or it doesn't bother trying to post it at all. And one nice thing, though, in the end of doing all this is that by using such a tool and avoiding trying to go too much against Track directly from any particular piece of code, when the time comes, when Track changes, when they add new things, I have to just change one library. I need to update that. And all my client code, all my different projects that are using these for rake tests are going to hopefully be oblivious to all these changes. So it helps buffer a lot of the changes that would happen. You can at least isolate the fragility of working against someone's web page as an API. And ultimately, Track is going to have just a plain old XML RPC interface, I think, as a standard part if it isn't in there now. So when that time comes, it'll make things simpler all along, but at least I don't have to wait for that point. All right. My next application that I then wanted to work with was WordPress. And the scenario here was I had some years back started working on a book beginning Ruby, and it was just a bad time to be working on books. And I finally decided I was going to put this on the web, and I wanted to do it in such a way that people reading the book can leave comments on the content. So I did the only reasonable thing. I decided to roll my own. And it started out as an Nitro application basically for publishing a form of an enhanced text style, and was hooked into its own commenting system and so on. And I had gotten to a point where it was pretty much done when I came across the Django book. Right? And I see you thinking, oh, I did it in Django. No. But the Django book is absolutely sweet. And I'm not talking so much about Django, but the comment system on the book side itself. If you go to djangobook.com, they have this book online while it's being developed, and you can leave comments, and there's this super sweet Ajax interface thing. And I saw this, I thought, well, this is like a bazillion times better than what I was doing, really more on target. So the only reasonable thing to do is to steal it. Huh? So that's what I did. So I contacted the author of the Django book. Said, dear author of Django book, I'm going to steal your code. Are you good with that? And like, yeah, great. He said, but what you should know is Jack Slocum had written these extensions to the Yahoo UI library. That's the meat and bones of the stuff. Why don't you drop by his site and give him a donation? So I did that. So it's all in the up and up. So I grabbed the code and started banging away on it. So this is what the Django book looks like. If you click on any of these things, you get a nice little comment thing that comes up, and it posts back and stores the comments for the chapter. And it's quite nice. It wasn't quite, though, what I was aiming for. In the Django book, I'm guessing what they do is they have the entire chapter ready, and they put it out there, and it sits there for a period of time while it collects comments. So the comments are attached to elements by position. If you go and look at the code for that, there's a bit of JavaScript that runs down the HTML and looks for certain characteristics, a class attribute, I think, of some value, and will know to hook the JavaScript and so on that part. If, however, you were to take a paragraph and move it later on the page or insert some text, all that falls on the floor. My approach was I want to just have, ideally, more frequent updates to the site. So if I added text, drop text, and so on, the comments should move forward. And so I had to do a bunch of hacking around and so on. So I thought that having a positional base would be a bit too fragile. So the basic idea for my approach is HTML elements will be given a unique ID. The IDs for that element will be driven by the content, which, given a long enough string, is unique enough. And the comments will map to these IDs and not to element location. And one of the reasons, if you're wondering why WordPress, is I really think it's kind of best of breed for this sort of stuff. And it's more one of these, hey, I wonder if sorts of things. I've seen other people talk about the idea of just using it because they may have a site that wasn't meant just for comments, and so you just route somebody off to WordPress site, which has nice admin tools. It has plugins for spam handling, for managing your comments and so on, for filtering. And why build all that stuff? Well, I mean, people who are building it, I'm sure you have your reasons, but for me, it was a good tool. So the process I came up with was I create the source HTML. I run it through an element processor, which examines the text for the page that I want to have comments on. It rewrites that by adding this particular ID and some class attributes, pushes in some more elements for adding scripting and so on, and it writes out a new page. So what's nice about this is, in theory, you could take any random plain HTML page that can get through HBCOT and turn it into a system that has commenting overlaid on top of it. And if you go up to beginningruby.com, poke around, you'll see it's quite similar to the Django book site. Change the colors, right? And so when you click on this thing, you get this box, and you get the comments and such that are related to this particular chunk of text identified by what amounts to a hash key for that bit of string. Now, a bit more about this particular process and how this works with WordPress is the client code, which is just an app that runs local on, say, my machine or on the server. When it runs through this HTML and it wants to modify these element nodes, it sends a request out to an application I've just arbitrarily called Comment, because it just needs a cool name, and Comment Engine just wasn't spiffy enough. So it goes out and hits this thing that sits and spins practically anywhere and says, I've got this text, I've turned it into this unique ID. Comment, in turn, will go out and send that request and goes and hits an instance of WordPress and creates a new post with the title of that ID. So at that point, all the comments that are attached to the content on the Beginning Ruby site are actually comments attached to posts on some whatever hidden WordPerfect instance, where every post is just basically this GUID that identifies a chunk of text. When a user then goes to the site and wants to add a comment, there's two things that happen. The static page just comes off Apache, just plain HTML. And same with the JavaScript that comes down. But when you make a request back, the request goes to mod proxy, which in turn routes it to this particular comment server. So there's basically two kinds of signaling going on between just the plain regular site, and then there's the commenting behavior that gets overlaid on top of it. My professional graphics here should make this crystal clear if my explanation wasn't. Okay. Are there any questions? So that, of course, is the web page, and you get the plain static HTML here coming off Apache. When you hit the comments URL, though, mod proxy sends this off to another process running someplace else, and that's the comment engine. And that, in turn, is talking to WordPress. Now, what I kind of like about this is, aside from the fact that I can now have comments that are attached to particular chunks of text and not so much positional elements, is when the time comes that there's a Ruby substitute that does just what I want in a way that I want, I can just drop WordPerfect and swap it in. And all the clients of this part just don't know anything about it. From all they know is they're making requests off to some URL. There's just some REST API. They hit stuff out there. They get back either comment counts or content or so on. So the good part about this is I get to use WordPress as my comment admin tool. And it's quite nice for that. The other thing is, this is only mostly true. It's plausibly usable with any website, which is, say, if you just have a page that generates static HTML, conceivably you could run this through this process and overlay it with enough JavaScript and so on, talk to a comment server out the back end and get commenting and markup for arbitrary elements on the page. I think it's a rather slick thing, rather than have to worry about building that in for any particular page you make. Okay, the bad part is I actually had to touch PHP. And to be fair, if you go and look at the PHP for WordPress, it's quite easy. It's quite clean to go in there and poke around and change stuff. Now, I really didn't want to do this, and I realized that there's all sorts of problems with doing that. But for one thing, when I update WordPress, well, all that goes away. So that was a hideous mistake. But it was kind of necessary because the XML-RPC interface, which ultimately what I used, didn't have the kind of behavior that I wanted. What I needed was a way to make a request that would go and create a new category. Because the way I use it, if I want all the comments for a given page, all the chunks on that page are part of a particular category. So it makes it easy to separate stuff out, but there was no MetaWebblog API thing, whatever, WordPress API that would do that for me in the version I have. I washed my hands afterwards, though, if you're worried about that. The JavaScript libraries are full of just like skanky stuff. There was a lot of XPath kind of stuff and fire-related stuff. So when I tried just setting this up on another website, I found just how hard it was to get it right. Because it's very, very specific right now to its particular environment. And if you go and look at, say, beginning Ruby and compare it to the Django book site, the structure of the HTML is quite similar because that was the path of least resistance, right? Just have kind of the same markup on the internals there, and it just more or less just works. And because this started out as sort of a monolithic application that was supposed to do publishing and commenting and evolved off of this, those of you who've ever seen Isle of Lost Souls will know what I'm talking about when I say this would thrill Dr. Moreau, because it's a weird melding of animal and human. Lessons learned here that WordPress is in fact easy to hack, but plugins are the way to go. And I've since been talking to some people who do some serious WordPress hacking, and they've given me some insight on how to do this, which makes it a lot cleaner. One of the things that is appealing to me about doing this sort of stuff is more and more people are distributing applications simply as virtual machines. There's a company based in Phoenix called Jumpbox that does this. They'll package up an application that runs strictly as a virtual machine of your choice. You can run it under Parallels or VMware or the Microsoft Virtual Machine or Zen. And it makes it very nice and it's very attractive, but it's extremely encapsulated. You don't really have the option of going in there and changing stuff, but in their particular version, their packaging of WordPress, I believe you do have the option of installing plugins. So it makes it a lot cleaner. It would protect me from any future upgrades. It makes it easier to drop stuff in. Repurposing other people's code can bite you hard. I think that's a known problem. But the nice thing is there was interesting progress in spin-offs. Just I hadn't planned on doing it, but it just sort of ended up that I may have a more general purpose commenting tool, which I'm pretty happy with. And I think that only came about because I was in this peculiar circumstances of just trying to use WordPress in my comment engine. Some of the techniques here basically are screen scraping, obviously, and there's different ways of doing that. DOM munging, once you pull stuff back, it's yours to do whatever you want and the tweaking and so on. And you have options here. You can either do it when you pull it back, or in the case like a beginning Ruby and the Yahoo libraries, you munge things up inside the browser. And ultimately what it comes down to is proxies, because you want to have all the nasty non-Ruby stuff on one side of the wall and all the Ruby goodness on this side, and the magic proxy thing in the middle. And depending on how you set the proxies up, it may make it easier to distribute things. I mean, there's no reason in the case of my comment engine that it has to run on any one particular machine, since we're just sending requests from one process to another. A couple of other observations. Most websites are offering real web APIs, which greatly simplifies all this. The track is going to have XML-RPC baked in. Even still, there's an advantage just making a point that however easy it is to go straight against some web API, you will still want to wrap it up in something, because at some point that API is either going to change or go away. And so proxies afford decoupling. And hey, it's just, if you understand some principles of object-oriented programming where you want to code to the interface and not so much to particular objects, it makes things a lot cleaner and a lot less fragile. So some good goals for doing this is to get a clean Ruby API for your client code, so that you can write code that makes sense to you and whoever you're working with, and not have to worry about the particular quirks or so on of what's being exposed by somebody else's API. Whenever I get a chance to become more familiar with, say, Track's XML RPC, it may not be the whole set of commands and requests that I find intuitive or want, and I may very well want to wrap that in some other way, so that from my point of view, I get the right code that just makes more sense, is more intuitive to a Ruby developer. Other things worth adding in is robust exception handling. Some applications just don't do that. You make a bad request, and it just either returns nothing or blows up, and it's much nicer if you have some proxying there that adds a bit more smarts to your system so your clients don't wig out when they don't get quite what they want. And just in general, these sorts of buffers will help you avoid some vendor lock-in, that at any point, if you want to change from WordPress to something else, from track to something else, it becomes less of a problem for all of your client code. Some variations on this, which I'm actually not going to go into too much detail on. Ruby Stuff's just it's a front end to a bunch of Cafe Press T-shirts. There was a bunch of screen scraping there going on, where I would just fetch the web pages for each of the different shops that make up this thing. And it's built with an early version of Mechanizing, but basically it's a static site. I mean, I only have to build the site once and then regenerate it when the time comes that I add new content. Interesting thing, though, is Cafe Press is now offering a web API, and they have some sort of beta development program and so on to make it a lot easier to go and fetch product information and images and whatever else, do searches and stuff like that. So it makes my life a lot easier, though what's also nice is what I have in place really only has to change at a certain point, and the bulk of my code that generates the site can stay the same, because all it needs is just a collection of data. So the part that was doing the screen scraping through Mechanize, at some point I can drop that out and replace it with a cleaner set of web API calls, and it works out quite well. So again, if you're looking to do something, you're concerned that you're going to end up doing nasty DOM munging and stuff like that, well, you might as well go do it, because it just seems that before long people are going to offer a decent web API anyway. One of the things, too, I learned when doing this, if you are trying to interact with another site and you're poking around, you should probably avoid fetching their page every 30 seconds while you tweak your XPath selections or your rendering and so on. So that what I came up with, I would fetch a page once, write to a local copy, then reserve it up with an instance of WebRick, and have my app talk to that instead of to the live server. And then I could just bang away at all I want until everything was just kind of right. It's just another form basically mocking out some live site. Cloud Panel is an application I started working on. I don't quite know where I'm going to take it, but it was an administrative tool for Amazon's Web Services Elastic Compute Cloud. And the thing that was similar but different here was it's basically a command line tool. And there are some Ruby tools for it, and there was some web stuff for it, but it wasn't as complete or interesting or obvious to me at the time. So what I ended up doing was similar to screen scraping. I'd wrap it up in various calls. I'd shell out, call things, get the response back, parse it up, and return that. And it seems nasty hackish, but it saved me an awful lot of time just having to retype things from the command line, which is pretty much where it was, what the motivation was. Looking at it now, though, and having spent more time with Capistrano, I would suspect there were a lot better ways to do this than the particular approach I've taken. So there isn't all that much I want to say about it, and I would think that actually for this sort of stuff, Capistrano is a good example of where you have a nice Ruby API and what is essentially a bunch of command line calls and so on. You don't even have to be aware of that so much when certain things happen, because you can abstract it enough that you don't worry about it anymore. That's basically it. Like I said, there were some other things I was going to toss at, with the Ruby stuff. I'm going to now have to go look at their web API to see how that works, and the same with the other things. And that's my talk. I want to also thank Pat Eiler for actually putting all this together. Thank you, Pat. We have time for questions? If there are any questions, the one or two? Yes?
I've got a quick question. When you're talking about the WordPress stuff for the commenting system,
yes.
And this is kind of specific, but you mentioned that you're using hashes of the strings for identifying it. What if the text of the paragraph changes? How do you manage that?
It does exactly what I want it to do. It doesn't find the comments.
and that's what you wanted?
That's basically what I wanted to do. My thought was if I change the text, then the comments that apply to that text probably no longer apply. And so when it goes and fetches it again, now there's residue, right? This is the part I didn't think of, which is my database will eventually, depending how often I change it, fill up with a bunch of WordPress posts for content that's no longer there. Okay. It's a problem I'll worry about when it becomes a real problem. Other questions? Thank you very much.